Isn't he cute? You can see his little flat tail. Pine cones, this is a baby here. You are a little dingleberry. In the roughly 2 weeks I've spent here in San Diego, California, I've come to realize that it is a very wonderful city with a wonderful climate that lends itself to an active lifestyle. There's a lot of cultural opportunities and a lot of wonderful museums. It's really a wonderful place to live if you like the mountains, if you like the sea, if you like being outside. But as my friend Gülhan, who is visiting from Turkey, pointed out, there's another thing here in San Diego which strikes the eye.
Her tarafa bakıyorum, palmiye ağacı görüyorum.
And indeed, she's right. There are a lot of palm trees in San Diego. In fact, I would say that palm trees are an iconic part of Southern California. When we think of Hollywood, or when we think of beach life, the first thing, or one of the first things that comes to mind is palm tree. One could, of course, stop at the observation that there's a lot of palm trees here and continue about one's life. But of course, that's not what we're going to do today. Today, we're going to look at the story of San Diego's palm trees. In the late 16th century, when the Europeans first started invading the area that we today call Southern California, there was only one species of palm tree alive or living in the area. The first exotic species of palm tree to be planted in the area was date palm, since Christian missionaries used it for both food and as a symbol of their pan-Mediterranean cult religion. Since that time, the Europeans have brought to the San Diego area a wide variety of different kinds of palm trees, from the Pacific, East Asia, Africa, South America, and of course Europe and the Middle East. We know from the fossil record, however, that in geologic time, there had been more species of palm trees here. For example, paleontologists have found remains of an extinct genus of palm tree, the Sabal or Sabal genus, in association with Hadrosaur fossils, which date to about 80 million years ago. And this is of course interesting for many reasons, one of which is that it tells us that it isn't only religious zealots who enjoy the fruits of palm trees, but also large dinosaurs. According to my research, the oldest evidence of palm trees, this is pollen evidence, it dates back to only about 90 million years ago, which coincides with a time period called the Cretaceous. And that was a time when Tyrannosaurus rex was relentlessly tortured and persecuted by Jeff Goldblum. This is interesting because flowering plants themselves are only about 140 million years old. That is to say that flowering plants are only about as old as, say, roughly birds. The oldest fossil of birds or bird-like dinosaurs is Archaeopteryx. Of course, here I keep saying flowering plants, and one of the things we should discuss is what is a flowering plant? Or put another way, what is an angiosperm? The reason they're called angiosperms, that is something like capsule seed, is the fact that angiosperms, that is flowering plants, raise their little seed embryos in a protected organ. Flowering plants are perhaps the most successful group of plants living on the planet today, and that is due to probably two reasons. The first reason is they have an incredibly efficient way of having sex. Instead of just having two partners, that is plant 1 and plant 2, they often bring in at least one other participant into the sexual act, which is often an insect or a bat or a bird or your standard farmer. One of the other reasons why flowering plants are so successful is that they often use fruits as a means to get animals, such as birds, bats, raccoons, and monkeys, to take the babies, the embryos, that is the seeds, away from the adults, thus both reducing competition between parent and young, and also reducing the chances for inbreeding. Interestingly, however, not everything that looks like a palm is a palm. In fact, not everything that's called a palm tree is a palm tree. Not only did humans bring palm trees that have not lived with each other for millions of years together in San Diego, but they brought other interesting lineages of plants which bear a superficial resemblance to palms. Another group of plants that make seeds after having sex is the gymnosperms. Unlike the angiosperms that raise their young in protected little modified leaf structures, gymnosperms raise their young, that is their embryos, that is their seeds, in essentially unprotected spaces. Gymnosperms date much farther back into the fossil record than do flowering plants. If the oldest flowering plant is, say, 140 or 150 million years old, the oldest gymnosperm is something much closer to 310 or 320 or maybe 330 million years old. This means that the origin of gymnosperms coincided with the origin of diapsids, or things that you roughly think about as lizards or crocodiles or something like that. Evergreens, the group is much bigger, much more diverse than perhaps you realized. In fact, some evergreens sure look like palm trees, even though there definitely are not. Okay, so here we are This is Cycas revoluta, and as you can see, this female here is very pregnant. You can see, here's one of the seeds. As you can see, the seeds grow in, well, let me get my camera out here. Okay, as you can see here, the seeds, they have this red covering here, which is incredibly toxic, deadly, and they grow here essentially in an unprotected nest made of somewhat modified leaves. And the entire Cycas family of cycads is characterized by basically not having female cones. The male cone that pollinated this, guys, is not here. This is not here. There's another female back there. Where is the male? Aha! Here we go. Here's an old male cone. Exactly. Not old. Wait, is it old? As you can see here. Yes. This is exactly that. Here you go. The male cone. So as you can see from here, in the Zamia family, we do have female pine cones, unlike in the Cycas family. And inside of each one of these scales, on the bottom, there are two little ovaries, let's call them, where seeds are growing. These are the male cones, which are pollen-bearing. These are, I think, old expired cones. You can see they're open and they break off very easily. They still have a little bit of pollen left, but these are in fact the male cones, the remainder of the male cones. And so despite the superficial resemblance to palm trees, as you can see on this Zamia plant, these are in fact gymnosperms. As I mentioned in my mad ravings on camera, one of the interesting features of cycads is that their seed coats, and most of the plant really, is filled with neurotoxins and carcinogens. And this is interesting because in my research I learned that there is a condition or a disease, at least in Guam, among the Chamorro people, a sort of dementia. And it turns out that one of the hypotheses put forward about 50 years ago as to the cause of this is correct, and that is that the Chamorro people were eating, or do eat, flying foxes, who themselves eat the seeds of cycads, thereby concentrating high levels of neurotoxins, thereby giving people some serious and apparently irreversible brain damage. Today, there are only about 300 species of cycads living on planet Earth. In the Jurassic period, at a time when large 25-meter Brachiosaurus-type dinosaurs lived side by side with Jeff Goldblum, there were many more types of cycads, and also many more types of gymnosperms in general. For example, today we only have one ginkgo representative, but in the past there were many more. Of course, cycads and palm trees are not the only frondy, palmy type plant that you can find in San Diego. Humans have brought others. And the other one is even older than palms from 90 million years ago and cycads from about 280 million years ago. In fact, tree ferns make their appearance in the early Carboniferous, about 360 million years ago. Ferns represent an even simpler way of both having sex and then putting your young out into the world. As everybody knows, ferns reproduce by means of spores on essentially undifferentiated leaf parts. Despite the superficial resemblance between palm trees, cycads, and ferns, they represent very different stages and very different approaches to the problem of getting sperm to the egg while maintaining sexual reproduction. While most flowering plants make use of go-betweens, in-betweens, a third person in the sexual process, often insects, hummingbirds, and bats, most gymnosperms just throw their stuff into the wind, just throw their sperm into the wind, counting on vast numbers, which means great inefficiency, to get sperm into the egg. Ferns also count on the same system of just sending out vast amounts of sperm into the environment, much like fish do. However, they can't even count on the semi-protected or protected embryonic development space that seed plants have, that is gymnosperms and angiosperms, and therefore represent a system that is closer to the way that plants reproduce in the open oceans, and in fact the way animals reproduce in the open oceans. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the different kinds of palm-like trees found around San Diego, and not just San Diego, but many cities around the world that have a similar climate or have enough sunlight or heat, generally speaking. I did want to make a couple of comments regarding the video, and the first of that is that I sort of inadvertently kept confusing the terms spore, pollen, and sperm. They're not the same thing precisely. I'm no biologist, I'm barely a linguist, but I think it is important to get this straight. Plant reproduction is different from animal reproduction, and there's sort of this generational thing happening where you'll have the adult plant produce essentially a different plant, and that different plant is the plant that sends out eggs and sperm and reproduces. So for example, with ferns, you have the adult fern that has the frondy stuff that does most of the photosynthesis. It creates these spores that go out, that get spread out. The spores become plants, and then the spores are the ones that are responsible for sexual reproduction. They produce, or the little plants, actually not the spores, the little plants that grow from the spores produce the egg and the sperm, which mate, which then produce the adult plant again, that will then produce the spores, and it goes in that cycle. By the time you get to gymnosperms, you've sort of encapsulated the system so that whereas ferns require a watery place for the things that grow out of the spores to send out the little eggies and spermies for mating, by the time you get to pine trees, to gymnosperms, they are doing this kind of the adult plant is hosting the sporophyte sending out of eggs and sperm. In a sense, fern trees, fern plants have that second sexually reproducing generation do its thing out in the world, hopefully a watery place. It has to be. Whereas gymnosperms are doing this kind of they're hosting this. They're hosting the bacchanalia inside the tree, and angiosperms even more so. They're providing an even better, safer place to have this sexual reproduction happen. I think that's a critical thing to learn, and it's also important to say that first of all, apparently most cycads are not ancient. I mean, in the fossil record, we can see that there are very similar plants to the ones living today. But according to what I learned on Google Scholar and from reading different articles, it turns out most of the lineages, or all of the lineages, I'm not sure, of the cycads around today are fairly new. They're from the Eocene or from a few million years ago, as opposed to from the Jurassic. I think it's interesting that despite the fact that ferns are sort of a simple system and pine trees are a more advanced system and angiosperms represent an even more advanced system of plant reproduction, that they are all still around. I mean, we do know of lineages of plants, say the seed ferns, that represent intermediate stages that are not around anymore. I think it's interesting that you do have a space that these things have adapted to survive, and that they are modern plants. Ferns are modern plants, cycads are modern plants, and then obviously angiosperms are modern plants. They're living side by side. They're not, I guess they're often called living fossils. And in a sense they are, but maybe, I don't know, I think it's reasonable to say that they're all modern plants. If they're still around, they're modern. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. If you like it, please make a comment below or like it or whatever. If I've made a mistake, which undoubtedly I have, please do make a comment and correct what I've said. Ultimately, my goal for making these videos is, A, it's a lot of fun, B, I learn a lot, and C, in a sense, I get to put some of what's in here and some of what interests me out there in the world. To maybe even have a conversation with people on the internet or my friends in real life, all one of them. I think I've got at least one friend. Anyway, thank you very much, and until next time, something.